The following video was sponsored by the Greek American Heritage Society of Philadelphia, preserving and promoting our community's history.
So the name Alexander Kitroeff, that doesn't sound very Greek to me. What's the history of this name, Kitroeff?
So I've been answering that question all my life. I tell people I'm Greek. Both my parents were Greek. I was born in Athens, but I've got this Russian ending to my name. And the research I've done hasn't yielded any results. It's still a mystery. The furthest back I've been able to locate the name is the 1870s, when my great-great-grandfather appears in a Smyrna newspaper as the official translator of the Ottoman governor of the island of Chios. And I cross-referenced that because I found my great-grandfather gives Chios as his place of origin. So I'm from Chios, but I've got a Russian-ending name that I can't explain.
It's amazing. We're with Alexander Kitroeff, professor of history from Haverford College. I'm going to try and read a couple of things here. We know that you've published several books, especially on diaspora communities around the world. You've worked on many, many films dealing with the same subject. And you are considered one of the foremost experts on Hellenism around the world. That's a little big for you, but I mean, it must make you feel good to be recognized that way. Let's talk about diaspora communities, your history, and your love of sports also, because we know you're a Panathinaikos fan, right?
Right. It's maybe diaspora and Panathinaikos are my two big loves.
Let's talk about a little bit more of your family history and the connection to Egypt and then America.
Right. Well, first of all, I think my diaspora connection goes back to having left Greece at 15 to finish high school in England, where I had some relatives. And I think leaving Greece early gave me a great kind of fascination and connection with the Greeks abroad. But my origins from Chios continued over to Egypt, because my great-grandfather went to Egypt at the turn of the century, as did thousands of other Greeks, because the cotton sector was very lucrative at the time, and Egypt was a magnet for the Greeks. And in fact, in the first half of the 20th century, the Greeks in Egypt, who reached a number of about 150,000, were the biggest and most important Greek diaspora community. And because of my roots and my fascination, I chose to do my doctoral studies on the Greeks of Egypt. I was in England at Oxford University, and I embarked on a doctorate. It took me 4 years, and I produced a short study on the history of the Greeks in Egypt in the 20th century.
This is probably premature to mention, but you've also, years later now, produced a book on the Greeks of Egypt, if I'm correct. Could we talk a little bit about the book, and why did it take so long to get this body of work together?
So when I completed my doctorate on the Greeks in Egypt, I still had a Greek passport, and I was in England, and I had to go back and do my national service in Greece as a Greek citizen. So I did 2 years national service in Greece, and during that time I was invited by Professor Harry Psomiadis to come to teach at Queen's College in New York for a year. And as the Greeks say, there is nothing more temporary. As the Greeks say, there's nothing more permanent than the temporary. Ουδέν μονιμότερον του προσωρινού. Professor Psomiadis asked me to come for a year. I stayed.
What year was that?
This was 1986.
86.
And having arrived here in the United States and wanting to pursue the career of a historian, I knew specializing on the Greeks in Egypt wouldn't really be productive, and the most obvious thing was to transfer my interest onto the Greeks of the United States, who, after all, the Greeks of the United States had taken the baton from the Greeks in Egypt. They had become the most important community in the second half of the 20th century.
How much is that basically what led to researching and producing these stories or histories about diaspora communities? Did you spend a lengthy time on different communities around America, putting this body of work together?
It did. Part of my motivation was the fact that I was in New York City and I lived in Astoria for 2 years. Not perhaps a coincidence. Friends said that that was one of the best places to stay. And being in Astoria, I realized what a Greek town is, and in fact was, because it's changed. So there was a wonderful fascination. I felt I'd crossed the Atlantic and I was back in Greece, in Astoria, and that really got me going. I said, I've got to research this. This is a fantastic phenomenon, not to mention the success of the Greek Americans in other parts of the United States as well. So that fascination led to me focusing on the Greeks in America, and I did that for a long time. And my recent book on the Greeks of Egypt it came out of the blue because the publishers of the American University of Cairo contacted me and said, can you do an overall history of the presence of the Greeks in Egypt? And I think that invitation has something to do with Egypt considering its past and trying to retrieve some of the cosmopolitan past, because the Greeks were there until the 1950s, when a nationalist government under Gamal Abdel Nasser eventually took measures that pushed the Greeks out. And I think Egypt is now looking back at its cosmopolitan history, so that was the invitation. So I went back to the history of the Greeks in Egypt, but I still maintained, obviously, my interest in the Greeks in America.
Have you gone to Egypt at all to do any of the research that you put together? And if so, what have you found?
It was fascinating, because when I was doing my doctorate in the late 80s, there was one remaining member of my family who was left in Egypt. Everyone else had left from the 50s through the early 60s, but there was this, she was my great aunt, the sister of my grandmother.
But an amazing reunion of sorts.
It was really amazing, and you know, I met a generation of 80-year-olds who were still living in Egypt, Greeks, Italians, other foreigners. I think maybe their pensions were so small that they couldn't afford to go back to Greece or Italy, so it was wonderful. And I saw the vestiges, what was remaining of one of the most impressive Greek diaspora communities in Greece's history. I mean, this is where the Benaki family prospered and then came over to Greece and established the Benaki Museum. Many other wealthy Greeks made important contributions to Greece. Georgios Averof built the Panathinaikos Stadio, which hosted the first Olympic Games, and you could see the wealth, you could see the old buildings there.
This is all a product of Greeks being in Egypt, is what we're saying.
Yes, it's Greeks being in Egypt, but Greeks being in Egypt and having a very close connection with Greece, because after all, geographically, it was next door, and there were frequent communication. You know, the Aegean Sea was a kind of north-south corridor for trade, passengers, and they prospered.
Okay, well, let's talk about North America specifically, but there might be some other diaspora communities you've reported on that we're not familiar with. Tell us a little bit about one of the other areas that you've explored as far as diaspora communities go. Chicago or other for that matter?
Yes. Well, my entry point in studying the Greek Americans was actually through the Greek American lobby, the organization based in Washington, which had obviously the support of all the Greek Americans, which mobilized in 1974 after the Turkish invasion and occupation of Cyprus, and a lobby was formed to persuade Congress to take measures, the US Congress, to take measures against Turkey. And in fact, a Turkish arms embargo was established by the US from 1975 to 1978. And I happened to read about that not only in histories of the Greek Americans, but in textbooks of American politics, because it's one of the big examples in American foreign policy of how an ethnic group can mobilize successfully to shape US policy. And that happened from 75 to 78, and I started studying the Greeks, their role in the lobby, and that took me, I think, my first archival experience to try and find out about the lobby was going to Minneapolis, where there is an important immigration studies center, and that's where I found the papers of Theodore Saloutos. Theodore Saloutos is the most important historian of Greek America. He published a book called The Greeks in the United States, which came out in 1964, and it's still a standard study. But the point is that Saloutos was not only studying Greek America, but he was actively involved in Greek America. So he collected a lot of papers. He had the papers about the lobby. He was interested in communities around the United States. And you know, if I think about it, Saloutos is my model now, because I consider myself
a follower of
Saloutos, inspired by Saloutos. I consider myself an academic historian, but a public historian, and I also consider myself a member of the Greek American community and wishing to contribute to the preservation of Hellenism here. So I've got this kind of wide range of interests.
And all that information you're talking about with Saloutos, is that all online, or do people have to go to Minneapolis, or is there a body of work through a book that we could be referencing, which you mentioned?
It's not online yet. It's still in paper, hard copy paper form in Minneapolis. And along with Saloutos's archives, there are a couple of other important archives. They're the papers of Dimitrios Kallimachos, who was an old editor of the National Herald newspaper, and a couple of other archives as well. And what exists in Minneapolis is something I think that Greek America should take notice, that luckily, because Saloutos and Kallimachos hung on to whatever papers they had related to the Greek American community, and fortunately the university accepted those collections into their archives, Greek American history is preserved. Without archives, without records, without preserving records, future generations of historians won't have any material to work with.
Oh, scary thought. Diaspora communities around North America, which ones should we talk about, and which ones are historically very important to the history of Hellenism here?
I've got to start with Chicago. Chicago was the city for the first half of the 20th century, the city with the greatest number of Greeks, about 25 to 30,000. At that time, around the 1930s, there were 4 cities with big numbers of Greeks: Athens, Alexandria in Egypt, they were still there, Constantinople, Istanbul, there was still a vibrant community, and Chicago. Chicago had so many Greeks that it was called Chicagopolis for the first half of the 20th century. What's left now is very little. The Greek town was broken up because a university campus was built on it. What remains is the famous Halsted Street with Greek storefronts. And one can visit there and you can still see the Greek shops there, but they are dwindling because now the Chicago Greeks have spread out to the suburbs, as do all the Greeks of New York, the Greeks of Philadelphia.
So as we said, Chicago played a key role for the diaspora communities. We mentioned Egypt, we mentioned Istanbul, and we have to mention a couple more here.
Absolutely.
Detroit probably is one of them.
Yes.
In Florida we have another place.
Detroit, Tarpon Springs, I would add after Chicago.
Those are key places where the diaspora communities form. Let's talk a little bit about Detroit. What happened there?
Well, Detroit's a very interesting history because you've got a Greek town as well, which now doesn't exist anymore because the Greeks go off into the suburbs, and eventually the issues that Detroit faces means that most of the Greeks actually leave the Detroit area. But the distinction Detroit has is that it's been celebrated by two of our great Greek writers. I should say the greatest Greek novelist, Harry Mark Petrakis, was from Chicago and has written about Chicago. Detroit has Jeffrey Eugenides, who has this semi-autobiographical, fictionalized account of growing up in Detroit. And then the labor historian activist Dan Georgiakos has written about Detroit in the 1960s and the Greeks getting involved in the civil rights movement there as well. So it's a smaller community in Detroit, but it's been recorded at least by two of our great writers.
Well, what about in Tarpon Springs? We've got an entirely different history there that deals with the sponge diving industry. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so Tarpon Springs is totally unique. In most cases, the Greeks come over to the United States and slot into whatever jobs are available at the time. But the Tarpon Springs community is a more deliberate, a more targeted migration of people who were doing sponge diving, sponge fishing in the Aegean, mostly from the island of Kalymnos, who come to Tarpon Springs because there is one Greek, Kokoris, who's actually from Aegina, not Kalymnos, but he arrives in Tarpon Springs, sees that there is sponge fishing going on in the Gulf of Mexico and says, well, this is something the Greeks can do. And he brings over Greeks from Kalymnos, and there is a continuous migration, and Tarpon Springs is one of the few towns in the United States where at some point in its history it can boast of having 50% Greek. Wow. That's amazing. I mean, I think it's Lowell, Massachusetts, which was a textile town and had a lot of Greeks, and Tarpon Springs, which has got the sponge fishing. And the significant thing there is that, and it's been recorded in history, that the Greeks are employing black divers as well. We have one of the early examples of good relations between Greeks and black Americans, because the Greeks are competing against the other Americans, right, and see the blacks as their allies. Have
they managed to hang on a bit in the Tarpon area? Because I think, if I read correctly, there's a high school in the area, and there's the Epiphany. Do they call it Epiphany City or something along that line?
And every January, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop comes and does the blessing of the waters with throwing the cross in the sea. But the problem was synthetic sponges that the industry changed, and therefore sponge fishing declined, but the Greeks stayed in Tarpon Springs and pursued other jobs, and it's still one of our most significant communities, is the one down in Tarpon Springs.
As we continue to talk, there are other communities that are popping up in my head. I don't know a lot about it, but we know when Greeks landed, they went west, especially into Utah, into the mines. Is there a history there we can mention that we know a little bit about?
There is a history. The Utah community and the miners have been recorded by Helen Papanikolaou. Helen Papanikolaou was both a novelist and a historian, has written books, autobiographical books, and also written about the history of the Greeks in Utah and the mines. And her son, Zis Papanikolaou, has written a book about some other miners, the miners in Colorado, and the well-known figure of Louis Tikas, who leads a strike in 1914.
Right, yeah.
And that's one of the instances where the Greeks have gone over west, working on the railroad, which is going west, or going to the mines, Colorado, Utah, and other areas. And by just the eve of World War I, they're becoming American enough to realize they're workers who need to pursue their rights and get organized in labor unions. So there's a history of the miners in Colorado and the miners in Utah and the entire Greek community in Utah. Eventually, of course, many of those in the Mountain West will filter further west into California, where, of course, there are many ethnic groups. The thing with California is it's difficult to identify the Greeks because they are so spread out. I gave a book talk in Los Angeles a few months ago, and people were coming from, people were traveling 1 and 2 hours away because the Greeks are spread out. So Los Angeles has a small community around the church and a famous Greek supermarket, Papa Christos.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's a landmark. Both the church and the supermarket are they face each other. Absolutely.
Is there anyone writing about that history that we have embedded? Because online I've noticed a couple of individuals posting the Greeks of San Francisco and a few other sites, and I'm wondering, obviously some people have felt a passion to preserve their history, but maybe it hasn't been written about or put together extensively enough for people to recognize. Is that accurate to say?
It's sporadic,
right,
and we have to rely on the occasional local historian. Many parishes have done good work. I've benefited from their work, and I would encourage Greeks locally, don't wait for a historian to come, because Greek American studies are a very tiny field in the United States. The community itself has got to write its history. Go ahead and record it.
We haven't mentioned it, but we're going to go over the border. The Canadian Greek diaspora community. First, I'd like to know, have you researched it? And if you have, is it different than the United States community? And if so, tell us where these pockets are and how are they different than ours down here in the lower 48, as we say?
I'll start with a story. In 2004, I published a book about Greece's relationship with the Olympics. It came out 6 months before the Olympics, in February of 2004, and then I went on a book tour throughout the United States and Canada, speaking to Greek Americans and Greek Canadians about Greece and the Olympics. One of my engagements was in the community center in Toronto. I have never seen a more passionate Greek crowd. In most of the book talks, I was trying to persuade people who were worried about Greece's prospects of organizing the Olympics properly. I was trying to persuade them that, the Olympics, ancient Greece is part of the Greek DNA. The Greeks are going to do it. They will do it even at the last minute, which is what happened. But people were kind of, okay, let's hopefully, thank you, etc. I go into this huge room in Toronto. I felt I was in Greece. First of all, we start with a Greek national anthem. The building was shaking with the most enthusiastic rendering of the Greek national anthem. And then the talk was being interrupted by applause, standing ovation at the end, it was really... The difference is that Canada is less assimilationist than the United States as a form of policy. It validates ethnic groups. The US validates ethnic groups, but it wants you to assimilate. You've got to become an American. Right. And then you can go and march on Fifth Avenue. That's fine. In Canada, there's more leeway for communities to retain their structure and their identity, and there's even some help on the level of Canadian provinces. And also, the Greek Canadians come to Canada after World War II. So this is you don't have fourth generation. It's either first or second, or maybe third generation. So they've got a closer contact with Greece anyway. But this kind of identity that they have is really striking in Toronto and Danforth Street, which is the Greek town. Again, it's really storefronts because
they hold this massive Greek festival every year, which is, they close the entire strip down. I'm probably wrong here, but I think they say something like a million people show up for this 5-day festival,
the festival. The Greek Independence Parade is always well attended in Toronto. It's really quite impressive. Montreal as well, which is maybe the most European of all American cities, also has a strong Greek presence along Park Avenue on the north, with very good Greek fish restaurants. It's interesting that the Greeks in Montreal chose to do kind of Aegean type of fish restaurants, and are very well known for that.
Well, I guess the main question I'm going to come to now is, this is we're in Philadelphia, and we've got a bit of a history here, which is kind of unique. You wrote about it in a 2011 article for then Odyssey magazine, and if I could read this quote, that introduces it, and then you can tell me a little bit about it. Ask anyone to name a Greek neighborhood in the United States, and Astoria in New York or Chicago's Greektown are the ones most likely to be named. Yet, Upper Darby, Pennsylvania definitely was a Greektown from the 1960s through the 1980s, with Greek Americans comprising 10% of its population. A stroll through the history of this neighborhood where Tina Fey grew up. This is the article where Tina Fey grew up in this neighborhood, in this town, essentially a small neighborhood. Let's talk a little bit about the Greeks of Upper Darby and the Greeks of Philadelphia in general, because there's a unique thought here that you mentioned to me privately at one point, which identifies two Greek towns. Tell us that story.
Well, again, to start on a personal level, I come to Haverford College.
Oh, that's right. We didn't transition you down to Philadelphia yet. So let's do that.
So I've been in Astoria, and then I come down to Haverford College. I'm living there with my wife and my child, but I'm missing Greekness, and I learned that there is this Greek presence. And I discover Upper Darby for two reasons. One, I'm looking for Greek food and a Greek supermarket. And the second one is I'm looking for a place where I can watch Greek soccer, because this is a time when you had to go to places which had pay-per-view or some kind of early form of satellite TV. And I visit Upper Darby in the 90s, I think, or late 80s for the first time, and I realize that this is another Greek town, albeit on the way out like all the other Greek towns, and it's not really mentioned in the histories of Greek America that I've been reading. If it's mentioned, it's in passing. You get Astoria, okay, Astoria is the classic Greek town. You get the old Greek town in Chicago. For some reason, in the Boston area, where there are thousands of Greeks, there's no Greek town. What's third? And I realize I'm looking at it. It's Upper Darby. And Upper Darby, no one has written about Upper Darby. And I took it upon myself, asking friends, looking at newspapers, looking at old Philadelphia Inquirer, through the database of Haverford College, to try and reconstruct this history, which it's quite unique. If Chicago is a pre-war Greek town and Astoria is post-war, Upper Darby is from the 60s onwards type of of Greek town, because it's the wave of migration from Greece that comes in the 1960s, when America opens up its doors to migration, and we have this settlement from the late 60s through the 70s, maybe late 80s. At that point, people have started to go off again into the suburbs, but it is an important. And I said, wow, this is the best kept secret. No one has done Upper Derby.
I admit to being part of that history. I came as an immigrant in '65 on a boat called the Christopher Columbus. We arrived in New York but settled here.
So I literally started walking through Upper Derby trying to find Greek evidence of Greekness. And there were a few stores left. There was a small little supermarket, I think, on Market Street, which closed. I think the owner was Mr. Vassiliadis from north of Greece. There's the Pontian Club, the Cafenio.
Right.
I think there was the Caesar's Cafenio.
Yeah, the Macedonians had left the area, I think, or right around then. Yeah.
Someone told me, one of the ways you can find evidence of Greeks in the residential areas, you just walk around, and whoever's got a satellite dish with Dish Network, which had Greek channels, then that means they're Greeks. If you go and knock on the door, there's Greeks. So it was difficult to assemble because there were no archives. It's oral history. It's newspaper information. I was pleased I could get an article together for Odyssey magazine, but I think the history of Upper Derby is yet to be written. Another important aspect of Upper Derby, of course, is Agios Dimitrios Church, and Saint Demetrius. I'm connected with Saint Demetrius in another way as well, because as soon as I got out my book from on the Greeks of Egypt recently, I was working on a book on the history of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. And one of the archives that I relied on were the papers and the magazines and the library of Father George Dimopoulos, who'd served many years in Upper Derby, and his son Art is in Washington, very active in Hellenic affairs.
Who also managed this magazine in its later years, Odyssey, yeah.
And he sent me part of his father's archive, which helped me build my knowledge of the Archdiocese. Now, the book on the Archdiocese I think it's a little bit like Upper Derby. I was interested in the history of the church, but there was no history written. I mean, there were a couple, but they were written from a church history point of view, theologians. Father Dimitrios Kostandelos, who was out in Richard Stockton College, and Father Fitzpatrick up in Boston, up at the theological school, but there was nothing about church community relations. And I was very, very fortunate. I got a generous grant from the Jaharis Family Foundation, which enabled me to spend time in New York looking at the archives of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, which maybe after Salutos, they are the next extremely well preserved archive. It's so broad because the Archdiocese, the church, embraces all aspects of Greek American life. That archive is extremely well furnished with all sorts of information, and luckily, thanks to a grant from the Niarchos Foundation, they've PDF'd. It's not exactly digitalized. You can't search digitally, but at least you've got PDFs of every single document.
You put together a book from this body of work, and how long did you spend on this?
The book it took 3 years to write, and then, I don't mind saying this, I had difficulty in finding a publisher for some reason. In the end, the University of Northern Illinois Press, that has an Orthodox series, took on the book, And that press has been absorbed by Cornell University Press now. So Cornell is distributing the book. But there were a couple of other publishers who have published Greek American books, but they weren't. It wasn't that they read the manuscript but didn't like it. They didn't think that the topic was interesting to them. That's including Princeton Hellenic Studies, which has got a great record of books. The church is unique, maybe. That's why publishers were a bit worried. But for Greek America, the church is community. Church and community overlap, and that's what maybe outsiders can't understand, that aspect of our society.
That certainly brings on another thought here. I guess I need you to forecast, since now you've produced this book, you've spent a few years on, where is Orthodoxy in America heading? And I know that's a very broad question to try and answer, but if you can somehow summarize it for us or give us your perspective on it, tell us.
Look, I always remember my mentor, Professor Vrionis, the great Byzantinist, always laughed when they asked him, and he said, "You're asking a historian about the future." Not sure that's right. But the way a historian would answer a question about the future would be to look at patterns of development and see whether those patterns assume that maybe if there's a pattern, that pattern might continue in the future. So that's one way of looking at it. And so,
have we changed? Has Orthodoxy in America evolved?
It evolved. The book describes how the church managed to adapt to the assimilation of the Greek Americans, and in a sense became what it was initially an immigrant church, and it became a church of Americans of Greek heritage. It transitioned. It wasn't an easy transition. The issue of language, of what language to use in the Sunday liturgy, created almost a civil war within the community in the 1970s, or not exactly a civil war, but the Greek-born element was protesting the Archbishop Iakovos's idea that maybe locally a priest in a parish where people didn't really understand Greek anymore, they should be allowed to use English. There was a big furor over that. Every time the church has gone to become a little bit more American, it hasn't been an easy transition. It hasn't been an easy transition, but it's been a successful and an effective transition, because the church has remained the most important institution. And I believe Greek American identity is being transformed. I think many people define themselves as Greek Orthodox rather than Greek American. So I think there's a trajectory in which the church will continue to become Americanized, but I think it's retaining its ties to the old world. The church, Greek Orthodoxy, is based on tradition. So even if it moves forward, even if it adapts, it maintains tradition. The best example I can think of is when Archbishop Iakovos wished to make a move to create maybe a situation in which we would have an American Orthodox Church, have, in other words, the other East Orthodox denominations join in an American church, the Russian Orthodox, the Slavic Orthodox, all the other East Orthodox denominations. They met in Ligania, which is a place in western Pennsylvania, where the Antiochian Church has a establishment there, and there was this famous Ligania conference was establishing the basis for maybe an American church. We're not sure exactly what happened or what would happen, because it was stopped by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and that led to Archbishop Iakovos's stepping down. But I think the church is still moving in that direction, but in a more deliberate way, without, and this is crucial, without breaking its ties with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Quite the opposite. I think the Americanization of the Greek Orthodox Church will happen, but it will retain very close ties with the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople, and the two institutions will help each other into the future.
Well, there's the forecast from Mr. Kitroeff. Let's segue over to another great passion of yours, which most Greeks have, that especially immigrant Greeks, football, or as we call it here, soccer. You've got quite a history and a love associated with the team Panathinaikos. I can barely say it correctly, but tell us a little bit about that, because you were known to hang out with the clubhouses. You're a known member of the Panathinaikos fan club, even here in Philadelphia. Your family has a history associated with Panathinaikos back in Greece. Fill us in.
So Panathinaikos is my great passion. My maternal grandfather, Giorgos Giannoulatos, was a president of Panathinaikos in the 1930s and a close associate with Apostolos Nikolaidis, who was a former athlete and administrator of Panathinaikos, and after whom the Panathinaikos soccer stadium in Athens has been named. It's called the Apostolos Nikolaidis Stadium. So I grew up as a Panathinaikos with my grandfather, and I think going over to England first and then coming over to the United States, the connection with one's passion, such as soccer, is a way that we sometimes preserve the roots with both our childhood and our homeland. And I maintain this very strong passion for Panathinaikos, and it segued into academic work as well, because one of the good things about working at Haverford College is that Haverford gives great emphasis on teaching and encourages professors to teach courses which are creative and interesting. And I was talking to the athletic director at Haverford back in 2000, and he said, you're interested in sport, I'm interested in sport. He was a kind of intellectual guy. Let's do a course. And we've got, and it started a very popular course called Sport and Society. And I taught this a course on sport and society, and then because Greece was coming up to organize and host the Olympics of 2004, I realized, hey, there's no book on Greece and the Olympics. I write a book on Greece and the Olympics. In the course of that, I found archives and material about the history of Panathinaikos, and then I published in 2008, it actually came out in 2010, a book on the first 100 years of Panathinaikos. It came out in Greek.
It's in Greek? Is it?
It's in Greek, and it wasn't distributed that well. It came out here in the United States with a great small publishing house called Greek Works, but it's in Greek.
Any calls from the Panathinaikos ownership or clubhouse in regards to the book, kind of praising your effort? We had a great book launch in Greece in 2011, and I had former soccer players there. My childhood heroes were there on the panel with me. It was a wonderful occasion. Truth be said, the Panathinaikos soccer team, and Panathinaikos is a sports association, which is the common way of organizing sports in Greece, so in Greece and in Europe. So it's got soccer, basketball, and a number of other sports. But both, especially the soccer team, has fallen onto lean years over the, let's say, charitably, the last decade. And I've been waiting for an opportunity to come up with a second edition of the book. But sport is all about winning, whether we like it or not. And I talk about Panathinaikos being the team that is the most European of the Greek teams. It fosters fair play, it fosters respect for the opponent, it brings in European coaches, it brought from Europe, it introduced a number of sports in Greece. So it's got this wonderful history, but without the club winning, you can't really write
a book that's going to be bought by people. So I'm waiting for Panathinaikos Soccer to rise again, to come out with another book.
So you recently transitioned into the film industry and telling stories with Maria Iliou. Let's talk about moving into documentary filmmaking and telling stories and where the future is for you.
So around 2004, 5, around that time, I get a phone call from someone and she says, I'm the filmmaker Maria Iliou. I hear you're the expert on the Greek Americans. I'm doing a documentary on Greek Americans. I say, who is this person? We met, and it was the beginning of a wonderfully creative relationship. I became the historical advisor for a documentary on the Greek Americans called The Journey, the Greek Dream in America. And after that, Maria's next project was on the Asia Minor disaster of 1922. And, I told her this is not exactly my expertise, but because we'd worked very well, I continued as a historical advisor for the documentary called The Destruction of Smyrna, the Cosmopolitan City. Smyrna, the Destruction of a Cosmopolitan City. There was a sequel to that called From Both Sides of the Aegean, which talked about the refugees that went from Asia Minor and Pontus over to Greece, and the Greek Muslims that went over to Turkey as part of the exchange. And then we did a small documentary on her grandmother, who was called Antigone Metaxa. She was known as Thea Lena. She pioneered children's radio shows in Greece beginning in the late 50s. So that was a fun documentary. And after that, we now face a gigantic project, a 5-part documentary on the history of Athens. The first one we completed. It runs from 1821 to 1897. It's the 19th century. It's when Athens becomes Greece's capital. And then the next segments will follow Athens right through the present.
Will these short portions be produced one at a time and featured individually, or will they be put together in a series and put out into the market for people to see?
I think they're gonna come out one at a time, maybe a couple, in case there's exhaustion by everyone involved. But it's a cumulative process. It's very slow. It's very difficult.
What's the time frame we set again to accomplish?
It's from 1821 through the present.
And when do you folks think you'll be able to put this 5-part series, as you said, together?
And the 5-part series, well, the 5-part series was going to end with Athens emerging from the economic crisis on an upbeat note. Now I think we're going to wait until Athens emerges from the pandemic crisis again, or maybe both crises, we should say, both the economic crisis and the pandemic. But for me, this has been an extremely rewarding experience. There's been a wonderful synergy with Maria, because I've gone in as an academic historian, Maria as a filmmaker, and we have wonderful conversations. To give you an example, I say, Maria, there is this very, very important thing that we ought to mention because it's part of the history. And she turns around and says, Alexandre, we don't have images, we don't have photographs, we can't cover it. Again, and there was another instance of the opposite way. She'd found a fantastic photograph of a Greek confectionery, a Greek American confectionery in either Nebraska or South or North Dakota. Alexandre, we've got to talk about them. I said, Maria, this is probably the only Greek shop in the whole of this area. There are no Greeks there. I don't think so. It's going to take a long time to research this. So we couldn't, that was sacrificed. So it's the historian coming and saying what the history should be, and then the filmmakers saying we are telling a story based on photographs. Photographs and images are important, and we're also telling a story in the sense that this thing's got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's got to have some drama, and it's got to have some emotional impact. Maybe the Asia Minor disaster, maybe the destruction of Smyrna is a very complicated thing, but it's also a very dramatic, emotional thing. We've got to focus on the drama and the emotions. It's taught me, as an academic historian, how images and storytelling is the best way of telling history. With all due respect to my profession, and I do think we need my profession to set the parameters, but after the historians tell you what happened and what didn't happen, the way you say what happened, it really has to be storytelling.
Amazing. Before we go, I just want to thank you, but I also want to ask you, if people are interested in picking up one of your books or reading more about the projects you're working on, are there several, or is there a website people can access online?
There are websites. Not to mention Googling my name will bring up a lot of hits, but I've got an official website at Haverford College, faculty, where I list all my works. And there's another website, Academia EDU, where academics list and in fact upload a lot of their articles. And I've uploaded a lot of my articles in Academia EDU, including the article on Abu Dhabi, which is one of my favorites.
Well, we want to thank the owners of Mediterranean Nova Grill here in Villanova, where we seem to be ending up quite a bit these last few years. Kostas Xinos is the owner, and he's actually a contributor to our program. And of course, Alex, we want to thank you once again. Best of luck in future endeavors, and keep in touch with us.
Thank you, Teddy. Thanks a lot.
For more information about sponsoring or viewing the interview series, visit the Greek American Heritage Society of Philadelphia online at gahsp.org.